Okay, so in about 3 minutes, right, Margaret?
We've started now, Mike.
Okay.
Laurie was very prompt at following instructions about 7 o'clock.
Okay, excellent. All right, well, 7 it is. So welcome, everybody. My name is Mike Fletcher, and welcome to tonight's Earth Speaks. Earth Speaks is a project of First Unitarian Congregation of Ottawa, driven by our 4-year congregational focus on the climate crisis. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, allow me the honor of acknowledging that we meet on the traditional land of the Anishinaabe people in Ottawa, people who have supported Canada despite some of the transgressions that the settler community has made. And we're very indebted to be here and to continue to support the process of reconciliation. I'm delighted to be able to introduce tonight's speaker. Markham Hislop is an energy journalist. I've followed him for quite some time, and he is also a climate journalist, I'll point that out, and is very prolific, has lots of videos, has the Energi Talks podcast, often on energy, sometimes on politics, which of course is all related, and writes a lot of columns, also a contributor to CBC Radio's Green Switch. So welcome, Markham. It's great to have you. We're delighted that you could join us and be part of our project here at First U Congregation that serves the congregation and the wider community to keep us all informed, make us more informed. And before I turn it over, I'll just mention, again, this is recorded. I think all of you will have seen that. The program this evening, please, if you have questions, just put them into chat. And after Markham's done speaking, I'll summarize questions we have that are similar. And we'll go with questions that I moderate for a while. And when that's done, fairly typical, we just shut off the recording and just have a little bit of chit chat towards the end until we're chatted out. So Markham, thanks again for joining us. Over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mike, and thank you to your group for inviting me to talk to you today about unethical oil. And I have to point out, I mean, I've been connected with Mike on Facebook for quite a while, and I always enjoy his comments. He's very, very thoughtful. He provides thoughtful comments on the posts that I do, and you have no idea how many trolls. How many really nasty trolls there are on social media. And so when you find somebody like Mike, you go, oh, you really appreciate them, because they're the ratio, I don't know what the ratio is, but it's a lot more trolls to Mike's, I could tell you that much. So to start off tonight, I'm going to be talking about unethical oil. And this is a series that we're doing on Alberta oil and gas through the lens of the Alberta Energy Regulator, which is kind of at the core, the center of how oil and gas gets done in Alberta. And, for me to call it unethical oil, I mean, you could probably guess at where I'm going to go with some of this, but the question becomes, is there an ethical oil? Well, they would like, the oil and gas community, many politicians in Alberta, and many Albertans would like to think that there is ethical oil. And where that came from, in 2010, Ezra Levant, late of Sun News, a Sun columnist, and now, of course, the head of Rebel Media, my bête noir in many ways, because he has been part of the rise of the far right. He supported the convoy occupation of Ottawa, that sort of thing. And he wrote a book, and it was called Ethical Oil. And it was basically a pushback against the tar sands campaign and other environmental groups who were criticizing the expansion of the oil sands. And for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with it, the oil sand are based on bitumen, And bitumen is very gooey. It's almost like peanut butter. If you could imagine oil in the form of peanut butter, that would be bitumen. And they use some fancy magic to turn it into a heavy crude that goes down to refineries in mostly in the Midwestern U.S. and increasingly into the Gulf Coast. And of course they have, everybody I think has seen these 37 giant tailings ponds that, you know, supposedly have now, I think the number's up to 1.7 trillion liters of toxic waste in them. And it's actually, from what I've been told, probably closer to 2.5 trillion, because there's some inventory that they hide the numbers. So anyway, Ezra Levant wrote this book, and basically what he said was, look, Canada has higher environmental standards, it has higher democratic standards, it has on any number of criteria, Canada ranks far above countries like Saudi Arabia and Russia and Nigeria and all of these horrible autocratic nations that treat their citizens poorly and are basically dictatorships. And so he said, therefore, ethical Alberta oil, particularly the oil sands oil, is ethical. And then, of course, that laid the foundation, because the oil industry loved that, and actually was fairly well written. He won at least one book award for it. Ezra is nothing else if not glib. That's for sure. He knows he's a former lawyer. He knows how to make an argument, and he writes moderately well. So, you know, it was an entertaining book to read, I am told. I wouldn't pick the thing up with it's kryptonite as far as I'm concerned. Nevertheless, he wrote this book, but that laid the foundation for something bigger. Ethical oil then spread into this mythology around oil in Alberta is the most environmentally responsible in the world. It's the cleanest in the world. We have the highest regulatory standards in the world. And this may not mean much in Ottawa, it may not mean much out of Alberta, but inside Alberta, it's astonishing the number of people who understand that, or who agree with that, who accept that. It's like, it's a catechism. When you get baptized as an Albertan, you have to believe in ethical oil. And there's a reason for this. The industry and its trade associations and the groups like Canada Action and, all of these, oil and gas supporting groups, they don't just do it for no reason. They have a very specific reason. And I call it narrative management. So what they do is they bombard Albertans in particular, but Canadians in general, with these narratives. I mentioned a bunch of them. And, and then of course they have their favorite, Justin Trudeau is trying to kill the oil and gas industry. Justin Trudeau won't give us a pipeline. Oh, never mind, he bought them one. I mean, this is not a rational thing. It's all about creating these myths, these narratives that you repeat over and over and over and over again until people just accept them. They don't think about them. They hear them in the coffee shop, they hear them at work, they hear them around the water cooler, whatever. And then, so they become part of the culture. And there have been polls done by people like Janet Brown out of Saskatoon that show that Albertans identify so closely with the oil and gas industry that more than half of them actually are oil and gas. If you attack oil and gas, they feel like they are being personally attacked. And a lot of this is because this campaign over, it started before Ezra, but it's intensified after Ezra in order to, build up this ethical oil narrative and myth that people have bought into. And it's very powerful. I mean, it sounds ridiculous. It sounds like, but when I'm on social media, if I go on LinkedIn and I run into people who work in the industry, if I run into, conservative supporters or industry supporters or, business people in the business community in Calgary when I'm there, this stuff just trips off their tongue. They don't even think about it. So it's very, very powerful. The problem is none of it's true. I mean, yes, Canada is a democracy, and yes, we're not throwing gay people off buildings as is alleged it happens in Saudi Arabia. And this is the kind of lurid prose that Ezra uses. We're not doing all of that stuff, but we're not. Alberta oil is really unethical, and I'm going to explain why. So for a long time, because I don't do just oil and gas reporting, I think of myself as an energy transition reporter. And I'm a very old school kind of. I learned in Saskatchewan in the late 80s how to do this, where you went out and interviews were that was your primary tool as a journalist. You went and interviewed people on the record. And when somebody said, I will give you an interview on the record, I will put my name to it, and I will stand behind my words in a court of law if necessary, then that meant something back then. And so I still use that practice, and I interview global energy experts all over the world. Probably 50% of them are outside Canada in any given year. So I follow evidence. And over the years, I've had various folks who are critical of the oil and gas industry. And I'm not talking necessarily about environmentalists, though those are some of them. I'm talking about environmental law professors at the University of Calgary. I'm talking about landowners advocates who are farmers, or they own land in rural Alberta and are upset with the oil and gas industry. And we talk about various issues. And it became very clear that the Alberta energy regulator was a nest of snakes. I mean, it was off. There were things going on that needed to be investigated, but I also knew intuitively that it would, if I ever jumped down that rabbit hole, it would be the granddaddy of all rabbit holes, be a Grand Canyon of rabbit holes. And so I resisted for a long time. And then in February, we had the big, the announcement of the Imperial Oil's Kearl oil sands plant had been leaking since the previous April, I think it was. And they didn't tell any of the indigenous communities. And they kind of found out, through local gossip. And I think one chief told another chief, and then they got on the horn to the company and found out it that way. But they never made a public announcement until February, this year, when there was a spill of 5.9 million liters of this tailings pond water. And at that point, that's a major spill. I mean, it might even be the biggest spill we've ever had, and they had no choice. And so because of the reporting of the spill, then the leak got reported, and then it blew up. And you may have seen that the House of Commons Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development had 3 days of hearings, and there were CEOs and indigenous chiefs and communities there, and it was it's been a very, very contentious issue, and of course I looked at that and I went, oh, look, I can't do it anymore. I'm going to have to just dive into this. So I started that, and the more it was a big onion, and there were a lot of layers to it. And I started peeling the layers and doing interviews, and it became clear that I needed to do that. There were a lot of problems with the Alberta energy regulators. I'm going to call it the AER. Everybody in Alberta calls it the AER. The AER's management of the regulation of the oil sands industry. And then I did a couple of interviews and became obvious. I thought, thinking, you know what? This is not just the oil sands. It's also the conventional oil and gas production. So conventional, I'm talking about wells, basically. And that's the wells. On the conventional side, you produce oil, light sweet crude oil, about 500,000 barrels of it a day, and also about 10 billion cubic feet of natural gas. And that Alberta is the biggest producer by far. And then over on the oil sands side, you produce about 3.2, 3.3 million barrels a day. I mean, Canada's the fourth biggest oil producer in the world. No, we're not small potatoes here. We're a major player. And so I realized that I was going to have to do both sides. I was going to have to investigate the regulator. I was going to have to talk about how that affected the conventional side, the oil sands side, but also the greenhouse gas side. Because Alberta produces 38% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions with 12% of the population. Because not only does it have all this, oil production that's leaky and creates very CO2 intensive, but also it's got lots of petrochemical plants, and it's got refineries, and so all of that industry together makes Alberta I mean, it's really, it's in a way, it's kind of funny because Alberta, is always complaining about how Ottawa beats up on it. And by that, I mean the federal government. But if you look at a graph by province of greenhouse gas emissions, Alberta, it just stands out. It's far and away much higher than any other province, including Ontario, which, has 3 times the population. So anyway, I started down this road, and the kind of stuff that I do, not that I have anything against environmental groups. I have friendly terms and I interview them, and I'm happy to do that. But with this kind of an investigative report, I had to have gold-plated sources. So I had to have law professors. I had to have scientists. I had to have former employees of the AER. One of them was a toxicologist. Another one was, responsible for managing data. Others were, tailings pond engineers. I had to have that quality of source because if I wrote a series like this, and it was all based on, Greenpeace and eco-justice and environmental defense, I mean, it would have no credibility. It just, would have a very small audience, and everybody else would. So I had to beat them at their own game, which was interview their peers. I had to go and talk to the people in the business and who are regularly commenting on the business. And so I've now done very close to 40 interviews. Tomorrow I'm going to interview the former Alberta Minister of Energy, Ken Hughes, who actually brought in, a decade ago, he brought in the current legislation that currently governs oil and gas regulation, and he created the Alberta Energy Regulator at that time. There had been some other kind of regulator, and they created this new entity. And what I found is that in 2018, the National Observer did a report, and somebody sent them a PowerPoint presentation from the AER, and in it there was a project that they had undertaken called Directive 11. It almost sounds like Area 51, and it's kind of like that because what they had this fellow who led the team. His name is Robert Wadsworth, and they said, you know what, we really don't know the value of our unfunded environmental liabilities. And what he means by that is if we had to go out and clean up all the wells out there and all the pipelines and all the gas plants and all the tailings ponds and all of that, what would it cost? Well, the figure was $260 billion. And since that time, the Auditor General released a report in March that said we need to add another $30 billion onto the conventional side. So I just say $300 billion. And I can tell you from the interviews I've done that $300 billion ain't going to get it done. It's probably more like $500 billion or $750 billion. Because take the oil sands, for example, there are 900 square kilometers of very sensitive peat ecosystem that have been disturbed. Never mind 37 tailings ponds, but you've disturbed all of this peat ecosystem, and it has to be restored somehow. And there is no place on the planet. There is not another country, not another jurisdiction, not another industry that has ever disturbed things at that on that level. At that, what's the word I'm looking for here? Not volume, but square. We'll call it square kilometers. Anyway, it's big. We don't know how to do it, and any value that we assign to reclamation costs are a shot in the dark because, we really don't know. So that's just the oil sands. Then on the other side of the equation, now you've got the conventional oil and gas. There are 82,635 abandoned wells. There are close to 90,000 inactive or suspended wells. And then there are some orphan wells. And all of these terms are really confusing. But if you thought of it like there's like 90,000 wells that have no owner, the company's gone bankrupt, and so there's no owner, there's no licensee. These wells are out on farmers' lands. They're out in, on landowners' property all over Alberta. There's no one to clean them up. So 30 years ago, the industry agreed, and this is back when they thought that orphan wells would be a little tiny problem. The industry said, okay, rather than putting up security, I'll get to that in a moment, rather than putting up security for our wells, we'll agree that we'll create this nonprofit organization that industry controls, and we'll have so many orphan wells and we'll clean them up. We'll just have a levy, and everybody, all the companies pay into it, and that's the levy, and then we'll whittle away at this inventory. Well, the levy last year was $72 million, and this year it's $120 million, and the industry is really squealing about that. So you've got $130 billion of environmental liabilities on the conventional oil and gas side, and they're squealing about spending $120 million. So this is the magnitude of the problem. Now, how do we get there? So I had a fascinating interview today with a guy named Patrick Montalban, and he lives in Montana, but just about 30 kilometers or 30 miles south of the border. And his parents are Canadian, and his siblings are all Canadian, but the poor guy, he alone in his family was born in the United States. So we commiserated. I said I felt sorry for him, and we had a good chuckle over that. And he is a vice chairman of the U.S. National Stripper Well Association. Okay, so what does that mean? That means, and I ran into this when I was in the industry for 5 years, and I worked in the U.S. and stripper wells all over the place. That's a well that produces less than 15 barrels per day. So basically, it's a depleted asset. It's at the end of its life, and you're not making a lot of money at it. You're barely, you're making a decent living, but you're cutting costs right down to the bone. You're trying to be as efficient as possible. And a lot of these, I say less than 15, most of them are less than 3 barrels a day. So it's not it's maybe making $150, $200, $250 of revenue, but it's also needs, electricity to run the pump jack, and it needs, there's all sorts of other costs associated with it. So it's not making very much money, but there are businesses, there's little producers that specialize in this, and there's lots of them in the US. And what I wanted to know, I said, Patrick, explain to me how this business model works. And so he went through it. And I said, now, explain to me what happens when a well is done and it needs to be reclaimed. And he said, well, look, every state that has an oil and gas regulator, it requires a bond when you first drill the well. So you drill an oil well and you put up a $100,000 bond. Let's say I'm just pulling a number out of the air, and you post that bond. You're the guy making all the profit on that well when it's fresh and it's a big producer. So you post the bond, and then basically the well, as it becomes more and more depleted, goes down the food chain and into smaller and smaller companies until you get to the stripper well guys. But they don't have to reclaim the well. The bond pays to reclaim the well. And so there's always money available, that it never gets thrown back on the state, back on the taxpayer to pay for it, because they had the foresight decades ago to say, you know what, you're going to pay at the beginning and the money will be available. That's not the way Alberta did it. Oh, no. What Alberta did back in the 50s under the Socreds, Ernest Manning and all that, is they said, we have 4 priorities for the oil and gas industry. 1, profitability and expansion. We want the oil industry to make lots of money, and we want them to keep increasing output. So that's number 1 priority. Number 2 priority is attraction of capital, because these are capital intense industries, and that meant that you saw the growth of service companies and all sorts of other businesses that were supported by those capital expenditures that were really good for the Alberta economy. Number 3, job creation. Why wouldn't you? I mean, that's how you get the voters on side, right? Number 4, and here's the crack cocaine of this whole story, government revenues, both in the form of taxation and in royalties. 4 priorities. You notice there's not environmental liabilities in there. So what they said is, oh, well, we won't worry about it. We won't take security at the beginning. That's what plays too onerous a cost on the company that drills the well. We'll just kick it down the road, and we'll assume that when the well is ready to be reclaimed, that whoever owns the well will pay for it. And we just assume that the company that drilled it will probably be the one that reclaims it. That's not what happened. What happened is exactly what happened in the US. As the well became depleted, it went down, it got sold, and then it got sold, and it got sold until it came to this little producer. And we don't call them stripper wells in Alberta, we call them marginal producers. And so right now, there are 155,000 active wells out of 464,000, and 60% of them are marginal producers that are going to fail in the near future, and none of them have security attached to them. So not only have you got all of these 80, 90,000 wells that are basically orphans and somebody's going to have to clean them up, probably the government, the taxpayer. Then you've got all these active wells that are getting ready to fail. And here's what they did. And this has been going on since the 60s or 70s. It's called liability dumping. So what you do is you do exactly that, kind of like the strip, goes down the food chain. But you sell, if you're Shell or if you're Chevron or you're ExxonMobil, you sell your wells to some little company, depleted wells, and they go off and they operate them for a short period of time, whatever, make as much money out of them as they can, and then they go bankrupt. So the corporate entity that owned the license, owned the well, is now bankrupt. So there's no owner. And so it goes into your orphan inventory. And so this goes on and on and on. In fact, there's a document from the 1995 that a professor shared with me that he FOIP'd out of the AER. And it shows how there was a tremendous growth of junior producers, like little companies, right? The junior sector was always thought to be the great backbone, the strength of the Alberta oil and gas industry. So what this showed was they went from like 60, 70 in 1974 to 1995, it was like 700 companies. And most of them were these little companies that had bought depleted assets from the big guys and were operating them like stripper wells, and then eventually went bankrupt and just, tossed here's some wells, put them into the inventory, the orphan inventory, and we'll just walk away and we'll go do it again. They would just, start up another company and go off and do it again over and over again. It's called liability dumping. And the industry is now the AER is starting to be a little stricter about this. But let me tell you the story of Sequoia Industries, Sequoia Resources, because I interviewed one of the farmers who had a Sequoia well on his property. And because Sequoia went bankrupt in 2018, he now can't sell his land because it has an unreclaimed well. It's an environmental liability. No one will buy it. The bank won't lend against it. The guy's 65. His wife is a nurse. She's got maybe 2-3 years left. They want to sell, move to the island. She'll work for a few years. They'll retire. They can't do it now. And because of this well, and there's nobody to clean it. And if he cleaned it, it'd be a $100,000, $150,000 bill. So what's he going to do? Well, nothing. There's nothing. So what this company did, there was an individual who shall not be named to protect the guilty, and because I don't want to be sued for defamation. But what she did is she had a company called Perpetual Operating Trust, and she sold all of those wells, both the economic ones that still made sense and the uneconomic ones, to a company called Perpetual Operating. So Perpetual Trust to Perpetual Operating. Then she sold the good wells over to another company off to the side, which eventually became called Alphabo, and renamed the company, the Perpetual Operating, that had the bad wells, called it Sequoia, and sold it for $1 to a couple of Hong Kong investors. Now, these guys, they get a lot of grief in the media and stuff when the story broke, but I've looked over the bankruptcy trustees, the description of it, and what they did is they set up a typical stripper operation. They went out and bought a few more wells from Husky and some other smaller companies. They had about 3,000 of them, and they had bought them at what they thought was the bottom of the gas price cycle. Well, turned out they bet wrong. And so the gas bumped along for about 18 months, and then it took another nosedive, and they couldn't keep the company going. And so they went belly up, they went bankrupt, and the wells got thrown into the orphan well fund. So they're now unfunded liabilities, like Dwight Popovich's well on his land. And there's a ton of lawsuits, as you can imagine. This is tangled, and I have to point out that there is none of this has been settled in court. We're all, we're looking at the documents we have. We're looking at we're inferring some of it. We're inferring from it, but no jury, no judge has rendered a judgment on this as yet as to who's actually guilty and who did bad things. But what's they're being sued for is because there are some regulations in place to prevent this, and the company, there were transactions that shouldn't have been allowed. They shouldn't have happened. They found loopholes in the AER's regulations, and that's how they got around it. They got and there's some question whether they actually got active approval or whether, but anyway, I won't bore you with that stuff. The point is, this looks like typical liability dumping. Mm-hmm. You unloaded your bad wells onto somebody else. They gave it a go, didn't work. Poof, next thing you know, it's in the orphan inventory. And now who's gonna pay for that? When you've got $130 billion worth of liabilities, the industry isn't going to pay for it. And here's the kicker. If you read any of my stuff or follow me closely, you'll know that I do a lot of work in the energy transition. Peak oil demand, some economists are arguing it's already here, like global peak oil demand. But if it's not, it's coming very quickly. And we're going to see probably by 2030 at the latest, we're going to see the beginning of the decline in oil demand. And that means now that you've got, 105 million barrels a day of supply chasing 100 million barrels of demand, and probably prices fall, and then more Alberta companies fail. And I mean, this is not good. So, and once that happens, once you hit peak and then you hit into decline, prices are not coming back. Prices then, now you're into almost like a permanent lower price scenario. So maybe right now you might have $70 a barrel, and last year you might have had $100 a barrel, but going forward, you might only get $40 a barrel, might only get $50 a barrel. And maybe your break-even costs are like 30 or 40. So if now, plus you've got to lower your emissions, and investors want money back. So if you look at where the oil companies today are putting their money, there's two places. One, they're giving back 75% of their free cash flow to their investors in the form of dividends and share buybacks. Why? Because investors are nervous about the energy transition. Oil and gas didn't do well for a long time because of downturns in the last decade. And they basically are being given their capital back. That's the sign of a sunset industry, according to Dr. Michael Verlager, who's a very noted American economist that I interviewed a couple of weeks ago. And so they have to give a lot of their cash in the bank back to investors. Number two, the federal government has said, look, we're serious about this emissions reduction thing. Well, you're getting an emissions cap here shortly, and you better spend some money. So what isn't being given back to investors is being spent on things like carbon capture and storage and other techniques to bring down emissions. There's no money. There is no money for remediating and reclaiming environmental liabilities. Now, just not long ago, a couple months, late 2022, the regulator brought in a new approach that calls for a mandatory spend. So everybody has to spend X amount of millions of dollars cleaning up wells. Well, in addition to what the Orphan Well Association spends and what the mandatory spend will be, it's about $1 billion a year. Okay, so it would take, at that rate, it would take probably 130 years at a minimum to clean up the current environmental liabilities. And of course, the industry is creating more all the time because it's drilling new wells, and it's got these 60 or 70,000 active wells that are still economic that are going to have to be cleaned up down the road. So they're not eating into the inventory, that $130 billion, at the very time the sun is beginning to set on it. The timing could not be worse for Alberta. And when you look at all of the chicanery that goes around the regulator, which law professors say is the absolute case study in regulatory capture, when you look at all of that, you look at the way the industry dominates the regulator, you look at its priorities, you look at its inability to get a handle on reclaiming these liabilities, what it lets the oil sands companies get away with, when you add it all up, and a lot of stuff that I haven't got time to talk about tonight. So you add it all up, this ain't ethical oil, this is unethical oil. And it's unethical oil of the worst kind, because it's claiming to be otherwise. It's claiming to be virtuous. It's claiming to be the best, the most environmentally responsible, and it's not. And that's why I call it unethical oil. And I tell you, folks, I'm not an opponent of oil and gas. I've argued in other columns that there is research being done to turn bitumen into carbon fiber and other advanced materials. And I've argued for a transition from using bitumen for fuel to using bitumen to make materials. Don't burn it, make stuff with it. It's an amazing resource for making stuff. There are technologies coming along like methane pyrolysis that will use a little bit of electricity, clean electricity, and you knock the carbon atom off the methane molecule, and you've got 4 atoms of hydrogen, and poof, you've got clean hydrogen. So there's lots of technologies coming along that will allow Alberta oil and gas to transition to a post-combustion future where you're making stuff with it, or you're making low emissions, low carbon fuels. We don't have to do the things we've done for the last 100 years. We have options. So, and those aren't being talked about in Alberta. So all of that together then is unethical. That's my argument, Mike. I hope I came in close to 30 minutes.
Yeah, that's great. No, that's good. You told a really good story. So, I mean, there's some questions coming. Maybe one that always screams at me, and Markham, you interviewed Dwayne Bratt at University of Calgary sometimes about politics, is kind of a political question. Like, there was just an election in Alberta. None of this seemed to get talked about. Rural Alberta voted UCP, and I'm not trying to get all partisan here, but nominally I would think of them as being the most kind of pro-oil of the two choices. But in the meantime, the farmers are having these huge messes on their land. Is this the Stockholm syndrome? Like, what's going on? Like, mentally, this just blows my mind. So, yeah.
The environmental law professors call this cultural capture. So industry captures the regulator. That's common. You see that all over the world. It's common. The regulator gets too close to the industry and begins to regulate in the interest of the regulator more than it protects the public interest. So regulatory capture is a known thing. But then there's cultural capture, which is essentially, if you thought of it as political capture, where the industry essentially, oil and gas becomes such a large part of the provincial culture and the provincial politics that the industry captures that too. So if you look at the NDP, like when Rachel Notley won in 2015, she was pro-oil. Now she brought in a very progressive climate plan called the Climate Leadership Plan in November of 2015. But I interviewed for my book. I've interviewed her any number of times, and she's strongly in the pro oil and gas camp. She negotiated with Justin Trudeau to have 2 pipelines, oil pipelines approved. She is not anti-oil. But here's the interesting thing. What she did, she doesn't know beans about oil. Okay. Like, she doesn't have a handle on these issues, and she has no interest in them. She, in a sense, is a very traditional New Democrat, in that public education, public health care, social issues, that's her bread and butter. She'll talk about that stuff all day long. But she doesn't like talking about oil and gas because it's a very technical kind of a topic, and she doesn't feel comfortable with it. She has nobody in her caucus. She has nobody in her party that has a handle on this stuff. And so when she was in government, she appointed experts. So she appointed Dr. Andrew Leach, an economist, to head up her climate commission. She appointed 3 co-chairs to head up an energy diversification committee. That's how she did, and it produced very good policy. It's just not policy that she could talk about well, right? She couldn't get up. Rachel Notley is never going to go to the Petroleum Club, the Calgary Petroleum Club, and give a speech about oil and gas, because that's just not her jam. And so the problem here is that allows the Conservatives, and this is particularly true under the UCP when Jason Kenney was the leader and then the premier, and it's now even more true with Danielle Smith, who is just like even further off to the. I'm trying to go to the right, folks. Anyway, what happens is that they just run riot with these crazy half-baked conspiracy theory pro-oil and gas narratives, accusing Notley and the NDP of trying to kill the industry, being in league with the Notley-Trudeau-Singh alliance that's going to kill the industry, and none of it's true. It's nonsense. But if Trump has taught us anything, it's that narratives don't have to be true. They just have to be plausible. You have to sell them hard enough and repeat them often enough, and people believe them. So the problem, for the reason I'm getting a lot of flack, I have to tell you, in Alberta from New Democrat partisans who generally like me, they don't like the fact that I say that Rachel Notley failed in this last campaign because she didn't come with an economic policy, but in particular an energy policy. And the people in Calgary, I lived there for 10 years. My kids still live there. And I know, well, my friends live there. I go there all the time for work. And there's one thing you learn in Calgary, and that is your personal boat, your financial boat, rises and falls with the oil and gas tide, right? You may not be in oil and gas. You might be 6 degrees removed from oil and gas. But you know that when the price of oil is $100, your life's pretty good. You're making, everybody, you and your friends are all making good money, and you got a good life. And so what Calgarians who are mostly moderate, many of them very progressive voters on social issues and lots of other issues, but on economic issues, you better come with a platform and a narrative that reassures them that you got the economy under control, that you're the person who can manage the economy. And she didn't do that. She failed at that. And in my opinion, and she's had 2 cracks at it now, right? 2019 and 2023. And she's failed on this count both times, failed very badly. So I've argued that she needs to go.
Yeah.
They need to have, yeah. Her supporters didn't like that. But what? I have a reasonable argument. I think it's a valid argument. And if anybody wants to, take a crack at it instead of just ad hominem me all the time, that's fine. Right. But anyway, So I hope that answers your question. I kind of rattled on there for a bit.
Yeah, I mean, you've explained the 2 syndromes that are running. I guess, yeah, it doesn't explain the limits of human intelligence to me very well. But anyway, nothing ever does, I guess. So I'll take a question from Jennifer Balcom, is wondering, is there any realistic possibility to hold oil and gas companies accountable for all this via lawsuits or some other avenue?
Oh, that's a terrific question. Thank you, Jennifer. That really is a good question, because there is a group. Dwight Popovich is actually the president of it, and Mark Doran is a member of it. And Mark Doran is an expert, he's a former oil and gas guy, and his family had a big fight with the regulator for decades over this well on their property in Didsbury. And he's the last, I don't know, 10 or 15 years, he spent steeping himself in oil and gas administrative law. You know, when you want to know what the regulation says and have it quoted chapter and verse and explained, Mark's the guy.
Mhm.
And what they've been saying is Alberta doesn't need any more laws. It doesn't need better regulations. It needs the laws and regulations that it has to be enforced. And this is the thing I think I mentioned earlier in my conversation. And if I didn't, I'll just repeat it again. So Alberta has world-class policy, legislation, and regulations over oil and gas. It has banana republic performance in the regulation, because what they've done is more than any other jurisdiction on the planet. And we're talking about comparable jurisdiction for oil and gas, like, Norway, UK, US, those kind of places. What Alberta has done is build in a maximum amount of discretion. So you say, well, what's the rule, Mr. Regulator? And the regulator says, well, Mr. Oil and Gas Company, what do you need it to be? And so the rules are just malleable. They're like plastic. You can bend them this way, you can bend them that way. You can bend them a little bit, you can bend them a lot, you can bend them not at all. You can have one arm of the regulator bending them a lot and the other arm of the regulator enforcing them, the way they're supposed to be. I call it Schrodinger's regulator. It can be both here and there at the same time.
Mhm.
But both world class and banana republic at the same time. And this is so what Mark Doran has argued many times, and he's quite adamant about it. He'll get right up in your face and tell you if you really want, is all it takes is the government to instruct the regulator to follow the letter of the law. Will that, now here's where he and I part company is, I say, as I argued earlier, the oil and gas companies, where they're spending their money, you can infer from that they have no intention of ever paying for these liabilities. They're gonna ride this ship down as far as it goes till it fails, and they're gonna get out. And they're gonna stick the taxpayer with the bill. And so I warn about that. And then Mark will say, well, we have an easy solution. Make them follow the law. Put a big enough levy on the Oil and Well Association, like instead of 125 or 220 billion or million, make it like 3 billion, 4 billion, 5 billion, make it hurt. And then let the Oil and Well Association get out there and take all these orphan wells and reclaim them. So there are ideas and there are strategies, but it would take political will. And the thing there right now in Alberta, with the UCP in government, with the industry being the way it is, there is no political will. So this takes us out to 2027 when there's the next election. And, by 2027, in my opinion, it's too late, because already we'll have seen oil peak and maybe be, on the way down. Markets get even more disrupted and there's more volatility. And when volatility happens in the marketplace and in business models, the last thing they're going to spend money on is old wells, cleaning up old wells. They'll be in survival mode, by the late 2020s. So it does. I have what I call the doomsday scenario. It's in part one of the series. And basically, doomsday scenario is where you've got financial catastrophe, because you're required to pay for all of these, $200-300 billion of liabilities, and that leads to an environmental catastrophe. The two of them together. So not only are you're broke and probably a bankrupt province, but you can't even clean things up. And now you're living in, with poisoned fields, and, you poisoned half of northern Alberta, and you've just made a mess of it. And there you go. That's one possible future for Alberta if the leadership doesn't emerge and step up and take care of this.
Mm-hmm. So to be clear, lawsuit's not an option.
Oh, I should have mentioned that. That is actually the Polluter Pay Federation it was set up in part to launch lawsuits. Hmm. And if anybody here wants to contribute to them, they can find Mark Doran, Dorin, on Twitter, and contact him. And I'm sure, if they want to make a donation or a contribution to that, because I think, personally, I think that until this goes to court and, and there's a precedent set, that nothing is going to change. So yes.
Perhaps to set a precedent, so perhaps a relatively small case could do that. Like, I'm just thinking of all the cost for lawyers and fighting the industry. Could David slay Goliath on this?
You know what? I'm not well enough versed in law. I wouldn't even hazard a guess. I don't know. It's sort of outside of my limited area of expertise.
Yeah. Okay. Susan Meller has a question about the tailing ponds. Kind of how long are they toxic for? Like, timeline for toxicity. I believe it's like I'm long dead if I live to even a ripe old age before they're not toxic. Would that be right?
The reason I'm hesitating to say that is I know this came up in an interview with Dr. Andrei Sobolewski, and Andrei is a specialist in mining tailings ponds. He started working in the Alberta oil sands in the 1990s, so he's got like 30 years experience with these kind of questions. And he talked about how his job in the early 90s was to figure out a way to neutralize naphthenic acid, which he said was the nastiest chemical found in that tailings pond soup. And he found a microbe or something bacteria, whatever the heck it was, that ate naphthenic acid. And he said we tested it out in small ponds, and it worked, and it was amazing. He said it was clear, and there were fish in there, and there were all sorts of, it was a functioning ecosystem. And he said then it was time to scale it up. And he said all of a sudden, it's just like all the momentum, all the air went out of the balloon. The industry just lost interest, and they went off in some other directions, and they brought in some academics, and he's never understood to this day why they didn't take the simplest choice available to them and fix the problem. I think the answer to the question is, can they be reclaimed? Can this be cleaned up? Yes, it can be cleaned up. What does it take? It takes money. That's really all it takes. If there's no effort made to do that, and bring in Andrei's fancy little microbes, then you and I and everybody in this room and all of our kids and grandkids and so on will be long dead before it's not nasty anymore. That's my take on it, but
Sure. Yeah. Okay. My friend Laura Brooks is asking, where's eco-justice in all this? Like, eco-justice, when you think of lawsuits, you might think of eco-justice. Are they a player at all as well?
I run into eco-justice once in a while. And I believe they are active, but not very active in the oil sands. They don't show up on my radar very much. Now, unless they're doing something very quietly, but that doesn't sound like an eco-justice way to, they're usually sending out press releases, and I have interviewed some of their people, but it's been a while. That's a good question. I I don't know with certainty because I haven't researched it, nor have I interviewed anybody about that. But that's actually, now you've given me a good idea for an interview. You know, get hold of EcoJustice and say, what are you guys doing in the oil sands? And if you're not doing much, why aren't you doing more?
Yeah,
So
sure.
yeah.
Yeah, well, the next time I'm signing a petition for them, maybe I try and hook that question in. Oh, yeah.
Oh, by the way, Mike, if you don't mind me giving a little plug, if you want to follow me and Energy Media on Twitter, it's I'm Political Ham. So political with a ham stuck on the little play on my first name. And Energy Media is just at ENERGI, not Y, but I Media. And pretty much the same thing on Facebook, except that I'm just use my first and last name, but Energy Media is the same. LinkedIn, same kind of thing, and I'm on Mastodon. So anytime if you want to, and then you can, if you go to the website, which is energy.media, excuse me, you can also sign up for our more or less weekly update. Sometimes they get caught up in projects and we don't get one out for a week or two, but generally we're sending out weekly updates with videos and podcasts. And we also have an app. And actually the app is far and away, like if you go to the App Store for Android and Apple, the app is it brings all of our videos, our podcasts, and all of our web stuff together in one easy place. And it actually works really well. Guy did a great job.
Well, having an app, that's I wouldn't have thought of that. That's pretty cool. Yeah, I mean, Markham, you're pretty prodigious. I mean, one gorilla question I could ask here is, have you cloned yourself? Which version of Markham are we talking to tonight? Yeah.
You know, this is, when I started in the oil patch in 2003. So my wife and I we were with a .com company and it went bust. And so we took the camera equipment as part of our settlement. We went out and we were in Calgary doing videos and that kind of stuff. So we took on a company that made Bornise tubing, which would mean nothing to you, but that, and they said, we kind of need a part-time sales manager to open up the United States. And I put up my hand and I said, I'll do that. And I didn't know how to get oil out of the ground. Didn't have a clue. So I learned, I just asked questions, right? Former journalist. And so when we started up our first online media company in 2008. I'm a naturally curious guy. And so I ask a lot of questions and do a lot of interviews and, and then when we started doing more, and I should mention, because this is relevant. In the mid 80s, and yes, I am that old, thank you very much. In the mid 80s, when I was doing my graduate work at the University of Saskatchewan, my thesis was about the transition from horses and steam to what was called power farming, 1900 to 1930. And power farming is basically tractors and combines and that kind of stuff. And so I had to read all of the classic technology adoption literature, people like A.E. Rogers and, early adopter, innovator, all that kind of S-curves, that sort of thing. So when I started doing oil and gas reporting about a decade ago, I found that because it's very technology oriented, that all of my all of that work I had done for my thesis came in handy. I had all the intellectual framework to do it, to understand it in a way that 99% of reporters wouldn't. And so when I started doing energy transition reporting, which is really about clean energy technology displacing fossil fuel technology. At the end of the day, that is the fundamental process at work, and it all goes up an S-curve and all of that. And so I just did a pile of interviews. I put in my 10,000 hours and then some. Yeah. And once you've done that, you have so much. So many interviews, so many studies sitting in folders, so many, you've got your head is just crammed full of this stuff all the time that you can start connecting dots. You know, oh, I see how this is. Now I see the connection between this and this and that, and it's the connecting of the dots that allows you to tell stories that inform readers and viewers and listeners, and make these things interesting. So that, and the ability to structure that, in all of that information, into narratives, so that I can explain complex technical issues like I did tonight, in a way without making it too complex. At least I hope I did. Then that has a lot to do with why I turn out a lot of material.
Yeah. Wow. Well, all makes sense, but it's a lot. Like I was in the past 2 weeks pushing myself to, okay, I'm going to have some more time for Markham for the next couple of weeks. And
oh my God, I got to spend more time with Markham. Oh yeah.
Well, no, all good, but oh my goodness, there's a lot. One thing I want to ask you about, I watched your interview with Cynthia Leach, and I quite liked it. I think I commented at one point on it, and it occurs to me, she had mentioned that potentially Canadian LNG is good because, for example, we have good standards for fugitive methane emissions. But if we have all these orphan wells, do we? I don't think we do.
See, that's great. And by the way, this is funny. While you said Cynthia Leach, and I immediately began scanning my Rolodex, going, Cynthia Leach. Who the heck is Cynthia
I got the
Leach?
wrong. No. At RBC.
Yeah. No,
I got the wrong first name. I'm sorry.
No, you didn't. But as soon as you said LNG, ding, I connected. But I mean, that's how many interviews I do, right? I don't always recognize the names of the people. But anyway, so the point is that in BC, because BC is basically electrified gas production and it has stricter regulations, it has a fugitive methane emission leakage rate of about 0.3. And most of your folks will know that 3% methane leakage is the threshold beyond which natural gas is not better than coal. So BC gas is, and then BC had the intention to electrify the LNG liquefaction process, and so it would qualify as clean LNG, like low emission LNG. The problem for Alberta is that its leakage rate is much higher. There are big issues with measurement. I mean, they would go out. How do you measure something? Well, they take this little thermal gun camera and they go out once a year or once every 6 months, and they take a reading at the tank. Well, this stuff changes depending on the seasons, so the data is wildly inaccurate. And they've been working to improve that over the last couple of years. So when they say, oh yeah, we've got the methane emission rate down by 40%, did you really? Do you really know that you did that? So there's all kinds of these issues that need to be taken with a grain of salt. But I read the report, and I push back against a lot of what Cynthia was, because I mean she's the assistant chief economist for the Royal Bank, and the Royal Bank is one of the biggest financiers of fossil fuel development in the world. So you didn't have to read between the lines to figure out why RBC wanted that report written, to promote the development of a Canadian LNG. Now it said, ostensibly, oh yeah, we just want to make Canadians aware of the options. Wank, wank, that kind of one of those things. And so, and then off camera, Cynthia said, well, I'm really not that big a supporter of LNG. Here's the problem. If you look at the IEA, BP, Bloomberg, any of the, round about 2030, LNG exports or LNG demand starts to diminish. Because Europe is now getting itself off gas. They want they're electrifying it a big way, lots of renewables. China is adopting renewables at an amazing rate. And so this myth that China is all about coal, China is trying to get itself, coal is going to peak in a couple of years and then eventually start to dwindle. And even in the US, everybody's adopting renewables. So the the forecast for natural gas consumption, well, for LNG imports is not great. And then on top of that, you know, the US just built a bunch of liquefaction plants in Qatar and Australia. And, you know, there's a tsunami of new supply coming on by the mid this decade.
Mhm.
So does Canada really want to be the 13th player in the 20th century fossil fuel? Is that the thing that we're going to be debating, you know, at the national level? Oh my God, can we be 13th in the race to be, you know, 13th on the list of LNG producers? You know, we ought to be talking about how we could be number one in like geothermal, or number one in wind and solar in North America. You know, number one in integrating renewables and hydro between the provinces. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that would make sense to be number one in, and being 13th on the list of LNG producers is not it, in my opinion.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Margaret's kindly reminding me that we're past the top of the hour. So it's open mic time now. So folks, if you want to join in, and I believe we've stopped recording. So if something's gotten you frustrated, you need to vent a little bit, you're welcome to do it